talking a little bit about our regional application of the national framework to assess vulnerability of biological components to ship source oil spills. A little bit of background about the program and kind of how we fit in and how it drills down to us in the peer group. Since '95, Canada's ship source oil spill preparedness and response regime has provided the overall framework for readiness to respond to ship source oil spills in the Canadian marine environment. So it was a national kind of framework. Since 1995, there's been a huge increase in the volume of oil transported within Canadian waters, prompting the government in 2013 to announce the creation of a world-class tanker safety panel. They established that with the goal to analyze and strengthen Canada's oil tanker safety program, as well as its oil spill response preparedness. And since its inception, DFO has had a large presence. There have been various DFO programs to implement panel recommendations from 2013. I won't get into all of them, but the iteration we're in now is PEER, or the Program for Integrated Environmental Response. One of the panel's larger recommendations was that individual response plans for the region should be developed instead of using the 1995 model or a national scope. It should be more regionally focused, and that's to reflect regional geography, climate diversity, and assess specific regional risks in lieu of a single overarching national response program. So we went through the 1995 national program in oil spill preparedness, and through the 2013 world-class tanker safety, and DFO Science has been involved since 2015 under various programs. One of the panel's recommendations was to structure an approach to determine biological components, their vulnerability to the oil. And in response to that, the 2017 National Vulnerability Framework was developed with the goal of having it being a national framework that was applicable to the regions. So we in PEER, one of our goals was to take the National Vulnerability Framework and apply it to the region. Next slide. Now I can't see anything. Oh, no.
It's a slide saying National Framework, DFO, CSAS.
You got it. Okay. All right. So the National Framework was laid out in a Science Advisory Report in 2017. And it was covered under the DFO Sustainable Aquatic Ecosystems mandate. The important takeaway here, and what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of the conversation here today, is that it was a two-phased approach. The first phase was to group biological components into subgroups based on very similar characteristics related to oil vulnerability. And part two was to score these subgroups against ecological vulnerability criteria, and then finally to identify the most vulnerable subgroups. The three criteria that were used in scoring were exposure, sensitivity, and recovery from oil. Next slide.
Yeah, we can see that national framework is intended to be.
I'm having a little lag here for some reason. I don't know why. Okay, the framework, a little bit about it before I dive into the phases. The framework was intended to be nationally consistent, but again, regionally flexible. It's very important that it was grounded in science, and that the final outcome was rapid and simple to implement in an environmental response. And the deliverable from my side of things was a concise list of biological components that are most vulnerable to oil in our region. Next one. Are we on scope?
Yes.
Yep.
Sorry, I have to ask because I can't see your slides. I'm going off my own here. Okay, so the scope, the vulnerability framework was not all-consuming and it didn't envelop everything, so it does have some limitations. The goal, vulnerability as defined in the framework meant that it means the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with injury or damage or harm. The focus of the framework was on biological components under the DFO mandate only, and that it was very ecological based. It didn't consider socioeconomic or cultural parameters at all. It focused on impacts from direct contact with oil and not indirect effects. It was not limited to any specific oil type. No mitigation measures were included in the application either. Next slide.
Yep, there it is, phase one.
So jumping back into the two phases, getting more in depth here. The phase one was grouping of the biological components and the development of our subgroups. The idea here is that building subgroups allows for rapid assessment of groups of ecologically similar species. That's the key. We've built subgroups in 5 categories: marine algae and plants, marine invertebrates, marine fish, marine mammals, and marine reptiles. The assumption here is that members of a subgroup will share similar characteristics with respect to factors important for vulnerability to oil. That's key. Right now, we're well over 2,000 verified species inputs to populate the subgroups here in the Maritimes. And I've developed roughly just over 100 subgroups. So we drilled down 2,500 species to just over 100 subgroups for our region. And the vulnerability scoring will take place at the subgroup level and not the species level. Next slide. This is an example, just one small example to take you through how we scored and how we developed our subgroups. This is a subgroup table. And you can see here, if you look up at the top, periphery, for example, all the peripherans that are in our region will fit into this subgroup if they are sessile, if they dwell on rock and rubble, and if they are intertidal. There's another category for subtidal, for instance. But for now, just think about the periphery that are in this group. So behind this subgroup, there might be 30 or 40 species, but as we score them, we're scoring them as the subgroup periphery. Next slide. All right, so working through the national framework. The inputs on the left are, of course, our categories and the species within those categories. We group them according to biological components, and our first output or our goal in our framework was to define the regional subgroups. And as I said before, those are luckily complete. Next slide, please. Phase 2 was scoring the vulnerability criteria for these subgroups. Assumptions here are that all biological components would be vulnerable to oil to some degree, but we had to come up with a suite of criteria to identify the most vulnerable subgroups in our region. 3 criteria were used to assess vulnerability. The first was exposure, and the rationale here is that species more likely to encounter an oil spill are assumed to be more vulnerable. And the 3 categories that we use, characteristics, to increase the likelihood of exposure to oil were whether species congregated or aggregated, whether they had low mobility or no mobility, and whether they interacted with the surface or interacted with the sediment. Next slide. Carrying on with the second criteria, it was sensitivity. The rationale given here was that species that have physiological characteristics that may increase the magnitude of impact from exposure to oil are considered more vulnerable. And the 2 characteristics included within the sensitivity criteria are mechanical sensitivity, such as loss of insulation or feeding structures, or chemical sensitivity. And that covers toxicity due to adhesion, ingestion, absorption, and inhalation. Next slide. The final vulnerability criteria the subgroups were ranked against was recovery. And the rationale under using recovery is that species that have life history traits that impact the ability to recover from oil are considered more vulnerable. And recovery in terms of our framework means long-term recovery from a single oil spill event. The characteristics within the recovery criteria that were used were population status, reproductive capacity, whether the species was endemic or isolated, and whether they had close association with sediments. Just a little more. So we have 3 categories. All characteristics within these categories were scored separately. So exposure would have 4 scores, sensitivity would have 2, recovery would have 4, it was a binary system in that if the subgroup fulfilled the characteristic, we gave it a 1 if it met the criteria, sorry, and it was scored a 0 if if it didn't fit the criteria, meet the criteria. The scoring was applied to all the subgroups, and it gave a total vulnerability score at the end of X out of 10. It was out of 10. So just next slide, Adrian. Looking back to our subgroup level table, just to harken back to it for 2 seconds and moving on to the next slide. Now you should be able to see an exposure scoring table that I used. So you can see on the left there all the tombstone information from the subgroup for peripheral. Let's just use our example. Intertidal rock rubber dwellers that are sessile are now paired with the exposure criteria and the scoring for the scoring sheet. So you can see above, this is the exposure criteria, and the 4 characteristics within the criteria are scored on the binary system. So under S would be the score for that particular characteristic, and then the framework had to be grounded in science. So we needed to give a justification for using either a 1 or a 0 based on known biological and habitat characteristics of the species. Not only we did that for exposure, as I said, but the other 3 as 2 categories as well, Adrian. Next one would be sensitivity criteria, and the 3rd one, again, they were scored on the recovery criteria as well. This encapsulated the majority, the bulk of the work for the vulnerability framework, because we had to find justifications for our rankings and our scorings for each and every subgroup. Next slide. Going back to the national framework, now you can see how things are coming together. Our regional subgroups, our output number 1 is completed. Our output number 2, which is to score the regional subgroups, is completed as well. And we are working on the final ranking of the subgroups with regard to vulnerability. And I'll show you what that looks like. Here is one of my final outcome tables. And again, to take Peripheral through to final scoring, you can see that the subgroup levels are still on the left, some example species, but this time I've added on the exposure score, sensitivity, and recovery score to give that subgroup a total vulnerability score out of 10. All the preliminary scorings for the 100+ subgroups have been completed. We're just going through some QA/QC to finalize those. So in terms of being far down the road to completion, I would say we are well on our way, which makes us very happy. So this is the national framework. I'm happy to say all 3 of our outputs are complete or in the final check area. And the where are we kind of thing, we have application and adaptation of the national framework to the Maritimes region is very nearly complete. The scores are all finished, the rankings are done, but they're still considered preliminary because our science advisory report is still in preparation. Happy to announce that we have our CSAS workshop in November of this year to go through the peer review process and offer up a final couple of publications on that and the proceedings as well. The national framework and developing it for the region has been a really important and fundamental stepping stone on which we use for applications in environmental response. Already we've had a number of applications of the framework, even in its preliminary form, in the Maritimes region for environmental response. And I'm going to pass this over to Adrian now. He'll give you a better overview of how this vulnerability framework has been utilized by our group in the Maritimes region.
Thanks, Tara-Lynn. Yeah, I mean, we've been able to use these vulnerability framework scores, the preliminary scores thus far, in a variety of different ways. We've been able to incorporate the preliminary scores into existing environmental response support tools and products that we've developed. We've also been able to use the preliminary scoring tables along with existing data inventories to identify potential gaps and identify areas for further data collection. And we've actually been able to use it during some of our response efforts as well. We've been able to use the scores to assist in protection prioritization efforts during resource at risk identification, which goes on. It's sort of an interdepartmental discussion of how we prioritize particular resources at risk to an oil spill, and having the vulnerability scoring, we're easily able to identify biological sensitivities that may be slightly more vulnerable than others, and have that grounded in science. We're also using the vulnerability scores to help direct the development of new environmental response science products and further initiatives so that we can continue to refine our ability to be able to provide effective support during an oil spill response. One of the items that we're considering doing, and some that our colleagues are doing in the Pacific region, is to work to expand their version of the framework to include specific petroleum products. So pending the response or the final sort of results from that, we'll be able to examine how well that will fit in our region as well, to be able to expand ours to incorporate specific oil products rather than sort of general oil at the moment. So there's a lot of potential in using the vulnerability score to be able to help support management in making decisions during an environmental response. And we're very hopeful and excited to be able to use this massive undertaking to be able to help refine our efforts. And I think that would be it. Any questions?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Terrell and Adrian.